If you're like me, you don't go anywhere without your cell phone. I mean, I've forgotten my keys, my purse, even my kids, but my cell phone is always in my hand. I'm not sure if that's something I should be proud of, but it is what it is. Our phones contain the story of our lives, where we've been, who we were with, how we got there, when we got there, and when we left. So it makes perfect sense that law enforcement officials are increasingly turning to cellular data to help solve crimes. It also makes sense that as the technology evolves, the court systems are evaluating these investigative techniques in real time. Today I'm going to break down how cellular data is used in criminal investigations and the legal arguments being made for and against the use of it. Regardless of the type of phone you rock, they all have privacy settings. You can decide whether or not you want to click the little toggle button on the location surfaces to on or off. You can also decide which apps can track your location and when they can track your location. When you download a new app on your phone, do you set it to always allow or allow only when using? Let's say you want to be uber cautious and turn your location settings off completely. The next time you get in your car and you open up the navigation app that you use on your phone, it's going to have no clue where you are and it's going to be useless. And if you turn that location setting off, is it really turned off? Before this week, I never really paid much attention to these settings on my phone, but now I'm definitely more aware of who's tracking my movements. When a crime is committed, the goal of law enforcement officials is to find the perpetrator and gather evidence to help prosecutors build their case. As technology advances on our cell phones, investigators are increasingly using our location data to build their cases. The first type of data we're going to discuss is cell site location data, or CSLI. CSLI data is broken into two categories, historical and real-time. I'm going to start with explaining historical CSLI data. So your cell phone operates by using radio frequencies. As you travel, your cell phone is constantly connecting to the nearest cell tower or towers using these radio frequencies. These cell tower connections are often referred to as an event or a ping by cellular providers, and they're maintained in call detailed records that are time-stamped. When law enforcement is investigating a crime and they have a clear suspect, they often obtain a search warrant to access this historical CSLI data on the suspect's phone. In fact, a landmark 2018 ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court stated that absent exigent circumstances, a search warrant supported by probable cause is required to obtain cellular location data for periods of at least 7 days. Let's look at an example of how this data might be used in a criminal investigation. If investigators are trying to solve a murder of an individual and they have a suspect or person of interest, they could request a search warrant to obtain the historical CSLI data on the suspect's phone to help show they were at or near the crime scene at the time of the crime. But let's say it isn't that simple because the suspect lives at the same location as the victim. The historical CSLI data could be used to obtain a timeline of the suspect's movements to look for potential discrepancies in their statements to police. So, for example, a man murders his wife at their shared home, but states that the murder occurred after he left for work at 7 a.m. Law enforcement officials could consider requesting the historical CSLI data via search warrant to verify that statement. A recent high-profile national case that has utilized historical CSLI data is the Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell case. Lori's 2 children, Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow, disappeared, and despite their mother's claims that the children were safe, as time went on, it became clear that this was not the case. The FBI's Cellular Analysis Survey team was brought in to assist investigators. Using historical CSLI data obtained from the phone of Lori Vallow's brother, investigators were able to locate the bodies of the 2 children. Real-time CSLI data is obtained the same way from your cellular provider, but is intended to provide real-time data about your location. It's often used in more urgent criminal circumstances. For example, let's say a child has been kidnapped by a known suspect. Investigators could obtain a court order for the real-time CSLI data to help locate the suspect. Okay, so now that we understand the use of cellular service location information in criminal investigations, we are going to take a look at another investigative tool used by law enforcement called geofencing. Geofencing is basically the reverse concept of cellular data information. So when you created your Facebook or Google accounts, did you read the lengthy user agreement before checking the I agree box? Yeah, don't feel bad. I didn't either. So these user agreements usually contain language that states that they will comply with the request of a judicial authority, law enforcement, or government agency. So in order to obtain a geofence warrant, law enforcement officials begin with a time and location. They then request data from tech companies like Google, Apple, Snapchat, or Uber, for example, to identify any devices that are in that specific location at that specific time. So here's a basic example. Let's say the ABC Bank in downtown Dayton, Ohio, was robbed on Tuesday at noon. Investigators could submit a warrant to Google for a geofence around the bank to see who was in the bank at that time. Google would then provide a list of data regarding their users who were in the bank at the time of the bank robbery. Law enforcement officials would use traditional investigative techniques to eliminate individuals and narrow down their suspect list. Recently, geofence warrants have been in the news more as they were used to help identify suspects in the Capitol riot on January 6. To explain this concept in a little more detail, I read a recent article on Slate.com by Colin Seltzer, who did a phenomenal job of breaking down the guidelines in three-step internal process of a Google geofence warrant. In the first step, Google takes the estimated location and provides a list of de-identified users. So it's a list of users, but it doesn't give their identification. Colin also notes that in this step, Google sometimes requests modifications of those requests to make them more limited. So after obtaining this de-identified list, law enforcement will go back to Google and request additional information on the de-identified users inside the fenced area to assess whether the users inside the geofence are relevant to their investigation. Finally, law enforcement then looks at the list of de-identified users in the second step and asks that Google identified their account information. In their recently released transparency report, Google has shown a 503% increase in requests for disclosure of user information between 2009 and 2021. These requests are categorized as subpoenas, search warrants, other court orders, emergency disclosure requests, pen register orders, wiretap orders, and preservation requests. Recently, the use of geofence warrants has gotten significant attention by the court system. In fact, on March 3, 2022, Judge Hannah Locke of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia ruled that the use of a geofence warrant in a bank robbery violated the U.S. Constitution by gathering location history of people that were in the vicinity of the bank without having any evidence that they were involved in the crime. Additionally, there have been instances where geofencing has incorrectly identified potential suspects. For example, in March 2019, an elderly woman in Florida was the victim of a burglary. A man named Zachary McCoy, who lived a mile away from the woman, was using the app Runkeeper on his phone to track his bike rides. Now, unbeknownst to him, Runkeeper shares their location data with Google. Remember those pesky user agreements I mentioned earlier? This is one reason you should pay attention to them. So, Mr. McCoy unwittingly became a suspect in the criminal investigation of a burglary simply by riding his bike by this woman's home and tracking his exercise routine using an app on his phone. Recent reports from sources that SLED has been using historical CSLI data and geofencing as a tool in their investigation into the murders of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh should come as no surprise. A geofence around Moselle could help SLED either verify Alec's story or find discrepancies in what he told authorities. Authorities could also try to use the geofence to see if anyone else was at Moselle prior to law enforcement being called. In addition, historical CSLI data on Alec's phone could tell SLED if he did take his dad to the hospital, if he was actually at his parents' house in Barnville at the time of the murders, or if his story is actually just full of lies. But remember that using geofencing in historical CSLI data takes time. Search warrants based on probable cause, the back and forth on identifying data with Google, processing the data, and then adding it to the rest of the evidence is not a quick process. So the question is this what could be taking law enforcement officials so long to charge anyone with the murders?